Thank you, Blessing, for having us, and thank you, PMI Sustainability Summit. It's a great pleasure to be back. I was here last time as well, presenting about early collaboration and procurement, and it's a real honor to be back and present to you an interesting topic like Blessing was talking about. So, uh, to start with, I have two requests. Number one, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I guess. It's a great opportunity to know where you're all joining from. So let us know where you're all joining from. Which part? I see we have global audience turning into this session, so it'll be interesting for us to learn where the product professions are standing. And the second question is, we had a Mentimeter prepared for you, and if that could be presented, yeah. Amazing. So we have a Mentimeter for you. So this is encouraging us to learn what are the current biggest challenges that you encounter when you talk about sustainability or embedding sustainability in your projects. And if you scan the code, we can have few seconds here. Okay, so you would see few options there. The question is, what currently is the biggest challenge to achieve sustainability in project delivery? I'll allow a few seconds for the audience to join in and share their responses. Would be interesting to learn what are the biggest challenges. And we promise that this session is going to address some of these challenges and how the real case study that has been delivered in North India has overcome them over the period of over the course of the project. Uh, can you confirm if you can access the Mentimeter or?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So the Mentimeter will be on, so feel free to revert back to it, and it'll be interesting to know what are the challenges. So having said that, moving on, my name is Subodh. I'm a project and a program manager working at New Cambridge Project Management. And I've been working in projects for a little more than 8 years now. And I work majorly in digital transformation projects. Apart from that, I am an active volunteer and a member of APM. I work very closely with Hugo in the sustainability interest group, and we advocate sustainable project management. And recently, we have delivered an session with APM on how to deliver a sustainability construction project. And along with it, I'm a certified PMI speaker. Like I was saying in the earlier, I've delivered a session the last time as well. And thirdly, I'm also working very closely with Green Project Management as a global sustainability ambassador. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here and share one of the brilliant case studies that we're going to share with you right now. And one last thing for me, sustainability is very personal. I always take opportunities to highlight the best practices that are being practiced across the globe. That is where I've been exposed to the Ananda project, and I think it's a great pleasure for me to bring this project in light, where Manisha would be sharing in few minutes. But before that, I would like to give a quick introduction about Manisha. Manisha has worked with global companies like Uber India and Unilever and Colgate Palmolive, and she has got over 25 years of experience working in CXO level, and she realized that there is a bigger potential for her to give back to community. That is where she has realized she need to move on giving value to community. That is where she has realized permaculture, embedded how permaculture could be used in the day-to-day aspects, and come up with a amazing project called on the project. And I would hand it over to Manisha from now, where she would be explaining her journey and how
Thank
she
you.
has built the permaculture project. Thank you.
Thank you, Subodh. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I will, without taking much time, move on, get into what I'm going to share with you today. And just to give you a little bit of a background, the Ananda project was initiated by us in 2010. The idea was to build some ecological security and future-proof, our children. We believed that we wanted to leave for our kids something more than just wealth. And the real wealth is really ecological wealth or a green legacy. And that's really what we started working on. Regenerated the landscape, restored biodiversity. We grew our own food, we harvest our own water. And after 10, 12 years, it was time for us to come and start living on this land. And that is when we were tasked with the idea of building a house. Now, many times we enter a space where we don't have any sort of stake or we don't have any attachment to that land. And therefore, when we are doing a construction project, if we do a little bit of damage, it happens in construction. So there isn't any emotional feeling about the impact of our project on the land. But in our case, since we had rebuilt the land back to being what it was, we were extremely sensitive and worried about any kind of impact that we would have on the landscape. So it was only natural for us to continue to follow the permaculture principles as we went into as we went into building a dwelling unit. We wanted to do exactly the same things that we've done in the garden. We wanted to catch and store energy. We wanted to, use and value renewable resources. We wanted to do a lot of observation and make sure that we are really integrating the structure into our landscape rather than standing out. So that was a very important task for us. And sustainability in project management, it does come with a lot of uncertainty. And so we also thought about what are we trying to do? Will this create long-term value? And we felt yes, because natural buildings are an extension of permaculture. They build on the story that we've already been talking about with the audience. We wanted to do some innovation. We knew that we had the capacity to take some risks, whereas a lot of other people may be happy to copy us, but may not be so excited about taking risks. So we were like, okay, we'll try to take some risks. We wanted to also focus on long-term expenses and energy efficiency as well, and not just look at what is it going to cost us today. So we didn't want to pinch our pennies in the short term and then, have a very high maintenance or a expensive house to run in the long run. For us, because we live in a village, we did not have that kind of regulatory compliance. But honestly, if you ask me, we had set a higher standard for ourselves compared to regulations. So I don't think the kind of things we've done, probably our governments have even thought of them. We've tried to design for a disaster. So, what happens if there's no energy? What happens if there's no water, no fuel, no communication, floods, extreme weather, like the kind you guys are facing in Europe? We've tried to keep all that in consideration as we built it. And one of my, ideas from my corporate experience came in handy here. We used to also always do a risk assessment of our projects. So that really sort of helped me to understand what are the possible things that can go wrong, which risks am I willing to take, which risks am I not willing to take. Also, my family was involved, obviously. And so if my own children are going to sleep in this house, I was a little bit worried about their safety, their comfort, and also, of course, the aesthetics of this place and how it integrates. So constantly talking to them, and you could say they were my stakeholders, and, I was delivering a project for them. So we've also done a few partnerships during this with a couple of leading, thinkers, and that really enhanced our own reputation as somebody who works closely with people. And these are the kind of things you can think of when you're running your own sustainability project. Okay. We talk about the triple bottom line and sustainability, and we talk about permaculture ethics, and you just see the similarity. It's just so similar because there we talk about, profit, people, planet. Here we talk about fair share, people care, earth care. So very similar ethics have driven our decisions as well. And we started off by defining that what is a sustainable house. And in our heads, we felt like sustainability means it will have minimal resources to build, It will consume very little energy or minimal energy. It'll be non-toxic. It'll be self-sufficient. And it'll integrate really nicely into the landscape and not necessarily stand out from it. So these were our sort of, I would say definitions and our standards that we followed. And we realized that there are three things that will come together. There'll be a design, there'll be materials, and then there'll be technology. So I'll talk about each one of these and how we applied sustainability in each of these three things as we built this structure. So let's talk about design. I think this is the part that a lot of people don't give enough emphasis to because it looks like the burden is really to be carried by material and technology. But the way you design your house and especially sizing it appropriately, because there is a tendency to overbuild and to build very, very large structures. But if you put an appropriate size for heating, cooling, and maintenance, already you've built a sustainable structure. Each space to have multiple functions, orienting the house in a way that we get maximum solar gain in winter and minimal in summer. So we looked at the shadows and the sun movement, using the CAD, the computer to see how the shadows and the sun will come into the house. And we've always tried to strike a balance between functionality and aesthetics, though I have to say that the architects will always push you in the direction of aesthetics. But as homeowners and project owners, you have to push them back in the direction of functionality. So we said we want to design a house which gives us physical and emotional comfort rather than something that impresses people. And at least, in India, the latest trend is really to build something that impresses people. And that was just not something on our agenda. And that really helped us to take the right decisions. So similarly, materials, we said we want to have minimum carbon footprint of materials. So what are the natural materials that we can find locally? They should have low embodied energy. They should be non-toxic. At the end of their life, it should assimilate into the environment and they should be biodegradable. And in terms of technology, we really wanted to use very, very low level technology. So ancient wisdom over modern science. India has a lot of labor. And we said, why don't we give employment to these people? They definitely needed more than, some rich corporation. So this is what we chose to build our house with, rammed earth. It's a very, very simple technology, labor intensive, but it took the soil from our own land, which we excavated to build some water tanks and a cellar, and used the same soil to actually put together this wall. It's a great thermal mass. It keeps the house cool in summers. It keeps it warm in winters. It was local free material, non-toxic, no paint, plaster, polish required. You can see it behind me. It's, standing and looking very nice, completely recyclable. And it was an acquired skill. We didn't know how to do this, so we had to get trained. We had to train other people. And it needs a lot of pre-planning because you need to put the wires and the conduits within the wall before ramming it. So it really needs you to think before you act. But you can see that it gives a really nice finish, and these are load-bearing walls. So there is a very nice aesthetic element also. The second thing that we used was stone masonry, and this is again because it's good thermal mass, but also locally available material. We live in a sort of a mining belt. So there is a lot of stone mining that happens in some of the riverbeds here. And we had a couple of really good stone masons in the local village, and I was very keen to employ them because, again, part of sustainability is to employ local people from the local economy and put money in their pockets. It's a bit time taking. It's again manpower intensive, but that worked pretty well for us. And the third thing that we've tried to do is use lime mortar and plasters. Again, it's a natural material. You may be familiar with the lime cycle that you can actually, keep recycling lime never-endingly. It's non-toxic and long-lasting. But the catch is that it has a long setting time. It's also a dying art and very much dependent on the material and the technology, like a mix of many things. So we've had some mixed success with this. There are places where the lime plasters have done well, and there are places in the house where they haven't done well as well. Now, to add on top of that, see, if our going in position was that we don't want any air conditioning, then you just cannot build a roofing system which adds to the heat of the house. Because then, you're actually building to heat up the house. So we've actually tried to look at low energy roofing systems, and we've tried 5 or 6 different roofing systems. I've shared a few examples here, like domes, brick domes, which are self-sustaining, made without any shuttering or steel. Filler slabs, which is really the basic minimum thing that you could do if you're building a concrete slab, and even a wooden roof, which is aesthetic, which is sustainable but expensive. So we've added low energy roofing systems, and it really helps to cool down the house significantly instead of heating it up, which is what a concrete slab typically does. And we didn't want to be obsessed with maintaining the house, so we've tried to keep it very non-toxic, very low maintenance finishes like lime wash paints. These are very simple to do. Anybody, unskilled person can paint the house. Lime plasters, which look like paint, but they are not paint. And even if you get a little seepage in them, they just sort of fade out very naturally. And like I mentioned earlier, some polished lime mirror finish surfaces in the bathrooms. So this is an example of what the bathroom looks like. See, we don't have any tiles, and we don't have the latest trend in the bathrooms. So it's built to sort of be very everlasting and very classic kind of a look, rather than something which is, something which comes and goes with times. One of the things that we learned from our permaculture experience was really to use small and slow solutions. Like, I just didn't want to use anything which has electronic parts, which has a lot of technology, apps, things like that. Because then when you have an energy descent, you'll actually just, your house won't function. So we've done very simple things like rainwater harvesting from our rooftops, literally taking all the water, putting it into a sand and gravel filter, and putting it into our water tanks. We run the house about 8, 9 months on rainwater. And gray water management, all the water from our wash basins, etc., goes straight into the gardens, into mulched beds, and that the microorganisms of the soil take care of that gray water. And we've kept it disaggregated. So we've not pooled it up. And that's why the volume is little and can be managed by the ecosystem. And for black water management, we've used a biodigester, which is a technology developed here by our Defense Research and Development Organization. It contains anaerobic bacteria, which is not great for the soil. But when you have good soil, then it can offset the impact. And so all the human waste gets pooled into this green box that you're seeing on this slide. And the bacteria eats the poop and releases a sort of a small stream of liquid, which gets absorbed back into the gardens. So very small and small solutions. Similarly, you can see there's a solar power unit that we have here. It's a 10 kilowatt plant. We've linked it back to the government's supply. So it's on a net metering, and we do give more to the government than we produce. And one of the things that I've done here, and I keep observing even now, is how to use plants outside your windows to cool down your house. So you can see this photograph. This is a Pulmeria alba tree, which is deciduous. So in the winter, it'll drop its leaves and allow the sun to come in and heat up my room. But in the summer, it'll be very green and it'll prevent the heat from entering. So this is how we do passive cooling. And an added benefit here is that they are very fragrant flowers. So you get a really nice whiff of scent as well from this plant. You don't need room freshness. And we use good old fire stoves for heating. We live in a forest which we've planted ourselves, so we have a lot of excess wood to use here. Just giving you an example of what our rooms look like. No air conditioning, even in 42 degrees Celsius. So we managed to get by. All right. So let's look at the P5 standard by Green Project Management. Some of these things I didn't look at when I was building because I'm not a project management professional. But as I started putting all this together to share with people like you, I realized how subconsciously we were doing so much of the green project management and other triple bottom line and other frameworks, how much we've used without even knowing that these were frameworks. So where people were concerned, we've worked with local manpower, we've given good working conditions, fair wages. The products that we've used, we've always looked for long lifespan and not convenience, not necessarily convenience. We've looked for low maintenance. We've looked for on-site waste management. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We've had very strong project management, and I'll again, sort of elaborate more there. And we've always complied with our conscience. I think if we just stick to what is allowed, your standards will be pretty low. I think the main moral compass that has always guided me in this permaculture project has been my own conscience and what I'm okay to do and what I'm not okay to do. So instead of putting money into corporations, we've tried to put money into the local economy. So I think this house has pretty much cost as much as any other house would have, except that we've spent 70% on labor and 30% on material. So the money has really gone into a lot of local pockets, and that's really what we like about it. So a few more examples of how we've done this. We've used salvaged and secondhand furniture. You can see the doors on the left. These were bought from a salvage yard, and then we had worked on them a little bit and made them look, nice again. But the house has a lot of old doors. We've got friends' furniture, carpenter's workbench we've reused, and a lot of low-tech fixtures and lights, because I just don't want anything for which I need to call in people and get them repaired, or worse still, that I have to junk it, because that's always, something that I don't like to do. And so leading to that, like producing no waste. Usually when we do construction here, typically people get rid of all the waste by calling in a truck, putting everything onto the truck and saying, okay, go dump it somewhere. Now, I don't know about the rules in the UK, but at least in India, these rules are pretty lax and you can just go and dump your waste anywhere. And I was not okay with that, because I was like, no matter where you're putting the waste, it's still some land, some piece of earth which deserves to be treated better. So we were very particular about what we are going to, how much waste we are going to generate. And for that, you have to plan, visualize, and then execute. And I'll give you an interesting example. The tank that you see on the left is a slaking tank, which was actually required at the start of the construction to slake our lime, because we were using so much lime in our construction. But I told the architect, I'm not going to break this tank later. So you have to find a use for it in the permanent landscape, because we are going to keep this, we're not going to break it. So he said, like, okay, let me then try to design it as a garden feature. So after the whole construction work was over, we cleaned this, we plastered it with that yellow paint, and now you can see that there are water lilies growing in the upper tank. There are lotuses growing on the lower tank, and there's fish which is hanging around, in both the tanks. So this is actually a very functional slaking tank, which could have been built and broken in the normal course. That's probably what would have been done. But just some little bit of conscious thinking, and you can really change how you think and do. One of the things that I found worked really well was that if you want to really build a project like this, you need three things. You need the drawings, you need the materials, and you need the artisans. And to get all these at the same moment, it sounds like it should be happening, but many times it doesn't happen. So putting in place an all hands, this term is actually something I learned at my experience at Uber India. That have an all hands, get everybody, all the functional heads, the electrician, the carpenter, the plumber, the mason, and any other specialist that you're using, get them together once in 2 weeks and discuss the rolling, the project calendar, that what are we going to do in the next 2 weeks, and make everybody aware of their tasks so that that thing actually gets done. And many times we've had to book the time of craftsmen in advance, because some of these, old technologies are now getting they're so rare that if you don't book their time, you won't get them to come in when you really need them. And scheduling work which requires curing early in the life cycle is also a very important part. And we built this house in 20 months. So that's pretty much as much time as any other project would have taken. But you have to schedule things the right way, and only then that happens. Architectural drawings in such cases might be a little And so when you're working, on a project like this, then you need to uh, be okay with the fact that your drawings are not going to be perfect. Some of them are going to be WhatsApp messages. Some last minute changes might be made on the fly. And for me, at least, materials and manpower always preceded the drawings because I am in a remote location project. And if the man has showed up and the material is here, honestly, the drawings are the least important part. And I did a lot of this kind of conversation with the architect on WhatsApp to deliver this project. In terms of materials also, when you use sustainable materials which are natural, they don't come with standardized specifications because the lime you source from one quarry will be very different from the lime you source from another quarry. So there is a lot of testing on site that you have to do your own sampling, create your own different sort of, small walls, see the strength of each one of them. So I can understand the temptation to use chemically made products because they are so they are so much to the spec. But here there is a little bit of hit and trial that one needs to do, and so you become really involved in the process. There's nothing standardized about it. And that's exactly what happens when technology with the technology and artisans as well. And you can see this image of under we are retraining ourselves and others. There's a technology transfer happening. The gentleman in the brown sweater is the master craftsman, and he's training the gentleman in the green t-shirt, who is actually the local craftsman. And so teaching and training semi-literate adults also comes with a little bit of challenge. But we still wanted to constantly work with the local team and put money into, like I said, needy individual pockets instead of corporations. See, sustainable structures, I feel they have a soul because you are surrounded by materials that are living. These are all living materials. And if I have a wall of earth behind me, or if I have a stone floor under my feet, or a lime plastered wall next to me, these are all living materials and their energy is very different. So we believe that the energy of the craftsmen get embedded in these walls. And so to keep the team motivated, happy, and positive is like a really important part of it. And otherwise, nothing will build properly. I mean, I've seen that in my experience that if a craftsman was actually a little bit moody and not in a good mood, then many times the work would just not happen properly. So energy and motivation is very important. And that brings me to this project life cycle thinking as well, that one of the very important things that I learned in this life cycle was really how, when you transition to something like this, to change your own lifestyle and habits. So when we came to live in this house, we were different people. We realized that now we are living in a house which has been built with a different ethos. We cannot bring our excessive consumption lifestyle from the city here, because here we have to manage our own waste. We will have no air conditioning. The house will breathe and creak and move, and all sorts of things will happen. And we need to change ourselves to fit into a space like that. And it's very important to define for yourself what you're trying to do. Because if you don't know what you're trying to do, then your goals, your standards will keep slipping, because there'll always be an easier and more unsustainable way of doing exactly the same thing. So having those goals for self and then eventually measuring, seeing how it's worked, do things work out the way you had anticipated? Like I have a temperature gun. I go around measuring all the surfaces of my house in the summer and winter both, to see which parts of my house are leaking insulation. How can I deal with that? Which roof is the hottest? What can I do with that? And manage my own energy consumption, my water utilization. A lot of these things you need to track and keep fixing if they are going wrong. So continuous improvement and documentation. I do house tours, share that learning with other people. So it's almost like, it's a living entity. And that life cycle is a cycle. It continues. And you keep getting better at what you've done. In fact, I always joke that the people who make the house now will do a better job of it, because we've studied everything that went wrong here. So let's talk a little bit about the costing of a sustainability project, because I think generally people will always think that, oh, this will be too expensive and it's not something that we can afford or we want to do. But the way we've looked at it is that we had a certain budget that we've stuck to, and stuck to the fact that we wanted to make something sustainable. So that is probably the best way to approach this, rather than saying, oh, I can make something bigger and unsustainable in the same budget. We said, no, this is our budget and sustainability is our compass. So let's see what we can make within that. And then we shrunk ourselves or our own ambitions to fit into that. And apart from the physical cost of a project, you also have to factor in a couple of things like what's your carbon footprint. I mean, we are not getting cash for our carbon credits, but you have to put a notional, credit for that. Also anticipate the future and see, okay, we'll be doing low repairs, we'll be doing low maintenance, and therefore there's some net present value to that as well. In terms of energy utilization and utility bills, I mean, if you just look at the next 20, 30 years, and we are not paying any electricity bills. So that's a huge saving, which we've sort of probably, spent somewhere. And also the cost of rebuilding or renovating for the next generation, because we didn't want to put this burden on our children that now they'll have to break it, they'll have to make it again. And you know that most houses today need to be renovated every few years, a new bathroom, a new this, a new that, because trends change. Now we want a fancier kitchen, now we want a modular kitchen, things like that. So we've tried to build something which will last, and we won't have the pressure to break it again and again. So we felt that a sustainable house actually made good financial sense for us. And the most important thing that we had to deal with was, there'll always be somebody who will say, Array, but you've not done this, you've not done that. But it's not all or nothing. It is a journey. And even I'm not absolutely sustainable. I also have parts which are made of cement, or some places where, maybe I've used material which is not great. But let great not be the enemy of good. I think that's what I would say. And let's not mock anybody who's trying to make even a small change, because then that person will just not do anything. So, sustainability also has trade-offs. Like, for example, the reflective tiles that we've put on the roof, they keep the temperature of our house down by 2-3 degrees, but they have high embodied energies because they are baked tiles. Then similarly, the solar panels are not biodegradable, or an energy battery bank, which we don't have, but had we put it, would be highly polluting. And the water tank we store the rainwater in is made of concrete and steel. So, it's not like, oh, either you're sustainable or you're not. No, it's a lot of asking the questions like, okay, why are we making this? Do we really need it? Why are we using this material or technology? Can we do without it? Can we use something greener? And that's really how a sustainability project gets done, and not just by uh, either slipping down each time and say, okay, now that I'm not doing this, let me not do that also, and this also, and that also, right? So you have to set yourself to a high goal and only slip up where you have no other option, rather than continuously keep making compromises. So that's really been my experience of building my own home. And we would love to take some questions now. I think Subodh is here as well, and so is my cat. But over to Subodh or Blessing. I think one of you is going to open up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Manisha. I really learned a lot. It has been an interesting one. I think we have one question here. How many opted for such house? Is it just a beginning or need wider level attention from government? These are model houses, but how effective and sustainable is it to face all 4 seasons? Should I come again?
Well, yeah, I think I got some parts of it, but not all. So if you can just repeat the first half. Yeah.
How many opted for such house? Is it just a beginning or need wider level attention from government? These are model houses, but how effective and sustainable is it to face all 4 seasons?
Well, so I live in a place where the temperature varies from 5 degrees Celsius in the winter to 45 degrees Celsius in the summer. So I have a 40-degree variation. So, and I live through it without any air conditioning as well. So definitely these houses are built to remain cool in the summer and warm in the winter. We also have a pretty heavy monsoon season where we do get a lot of torrential rain. So they survive the rain as well. So in my experience, this house is faring, I think, better than some of the concrete constructions that I see in the city. So that answers the first part. I think the second part, like, is it a one-off? Probably. I mean, I'm sure it's a one-off because I know I've done it, but I can now see people around me trying to take some ideas and inspiration and do something more. I come from that school of thought where I don't want to wait for governments to change. I would rather change and influence individuals. The reason being, I come from a consumer marketing background, and I know that the most powerful people on the planet are consumers, are each one of us, are each one of us as individuals. We are the most powerful people. So if we can start voting with our money and we can say, okay, I'm not going to use this material or that, that's the quickest way to bring change and not necessarily through the government route. So I think for the government to mandate something like this, it's decades away. But for some people who care about the planet to start adopting this, I think that's starting to happen.
Okay. Okay, that's great. The second one, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, the second one, if truly sustainable projects require different materials, skills, and ways of thinking, should conventional project success metrics be considered part of the
C'est
problem rather than the
tombé,
solution?
ça pris tout dans la même affaire là.
Oh, sorry, who's that?
Baisser
Let
mon
me
volume
mute.
là d'abord.
Think of muted the person. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. If truly sustainable projects require different materials, skills, and ways of thinking, should conventional project success metrics be considered part of the problem rather than the solution?
Well, I'm not sure what success metrics you are using in your conventional projects, but all the metrics that I have reviewed from a sustainability project management perspective are very similar to permaculture principles and metrics. So if you're following those, that you're on the right track. But I think, you know, we need to, it's about changing our own mindset much more than changing anything. I have seen here that it's the same metrics that I've followed, except that my goals and my expectations of myself were a little bit different and higher. And I think that's really what we need to focus on.
Okay, so I have another one. When sustainability goals clash with budgets, schedule, and resource constraints, our project manager making pragmatic decisions or quietly compromising the future for short-term convenience? So when you have issues with like the budget, the schedule, or the resources tight, are project managers making pragmatic decision or quietly compromising the future for short-term convenience?
Well, I think project managers have to answer that. I'm not a conventional project manager. I have only made one project till now, but I think that's for you to answer and not for me to answer. Yeah.
Okay, then the last one, I know you talked about this just to throw more light, is that what if the biggest barrier to sustainable development isn't technology or funding, but the assumption that sustainability must be delivered as a perfect transformation instead of a series of incremental project decisions? I think you've answered this, but if you could just throw more light in it.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's very easy to live sustainably and live with nature. It's very easy. Believe me, I mean, I'm doing this. I've lived in Mumbai, I've lived in Delhi, I now live in a village. It's very easy. It's just something that's not been marketed and nobody has advertised it. So as a result, we are so much in the race to make things and to make structures and projects which are catering to some other standard altogether, And because it's been marketed as, oh, this is luxury, this is premium, this is fantastic, everybody feels the urge to do the same thing. So as a project manager, if you can start thinking from first principles, like I'll give you a classic example. Steel and glass skyscrapers are very common in the West. You see, New York was built probably way before with these kind of skyscrapers. Now, those are cold climate countries, and they can stand out in the sun and try to get the sun in. But to follow the same architecture in India makes no sense at all because we are a hot country. But you will see that we are making the same buildings here now. It's just because we want our cities to look like New York. But that is just a flawed thought. But the New York buildings have been sold to us through all the marketing and all the aspiration as let's make Mumbai New York like New York, or let's make Delhi like New York. But we don't need to
Okay.
look like New York. So
Okay.
it's all about really how you define your goals and how much confidence you have and self-belief you have in what you are doing. And don't just copy people blindly. And that's really what I would say. A lot of it is just the mob mentality. Everybody's doing it, so we should do it too.
Okay. Then we're just going to take the last one is, to what extent do you think we could use permaculture and ecodome to address the sustainable, affordable housing problem?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Blessing.
To what extent do you think we could use permaculture and ecodome to address the sustainable, affordable housing problem?
I think a lot, because it's ironical that the new houses which are being sold to people as the cheaper economical housing, and what we in India we call it the pakka house. That means the house that will last forever because it's made out of cement and steel. And our old houses were called kacha houses. That means they were not. They are made out of earth, so they are not built to last. But the reality is, the earth houses outlast the concrete houses. They outlast them by decades and centuries, right? But there is no industry that benefits from a house made out of earth because you are simply digging up your own earth. You're collecting your villagers around you and you're building your house. Nobody benefits. So therefore, nobody promotes it. So the problem it has been solved, by the way. The low-cost housing problem has been solved. It was solved 5 centuries ago, or maybe 100 centuries ago. But somebody is now telling us it's a problem, and hey, I'll give you the solution, because that's where everybody makes money.
Okay. Thank you very much, Manisha. Thank you very much, Subodh. That has been an interesting session. And also for everyone, if you could please complete the short METI survey covering this session. And at the end of the survey, you'll be able to get your PDU code. Is in the chat, the METI survey. And we want to use this opportunity to appreciate Manisha and Subodh for giving your time, resource, energy, and everything to ensure that this session was a success. We really appreciate. And we pray that the knowledge won't stop here, will become more sustainable little by little. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
very
Thank you
much,
for having me.
Joseph. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.